you so much. I think it's a pleasure now you introduce yourself to our listeners.
Thank you very much. I'm Pierre Lumumba. I'm Kenyan, and I'm happy to join you in this short conversation.
Thank you, Professor. We would like to see what is your reading on the events in South Sudan in light of the transitional unity government extension is then in the office again for the second time.
Let us first begin by saying that South Sudan has had its political problems like many African countries after regaining independence and after a long war. And there are certain fundamental things, in my view, that are yet to be concretized in South Sudan. Mm-hmm. And these things have not allowed certain critical things to be undertaken. Number one, the constitutional dispensation in South Sudan must be stabilized. In other words, it is necessary to have a constitution which is endorsed by a critical majority of South Sudanese. Number two, we know that the politicians have been engaged in different problems, and that indeed is what gave birth to the transitional government of national unity. It was assumed that during this transition, certain things would happen. One, that there would be a new constitution. Two, that critical things such as census would be undertaken. But you and me know that that has not happened. The net effect, therefore, is that the country is not ready to go into the next phase, which is an election. And for that reason, which is a very practical reason, and on the understanding that the 2 years will be used to do the things that have not been done, the country should now engage the overdrive gear and ensure that the fundamentals are implemented so that in 2 years there will be a credible election in South Sudan.
Professor, do you think that this extension this time round will help for the tasks that has not been fulfilled to be fulfilled, including, as you mentioned, the constitution? Because even the previous extension, they had time for them to implement some of those agreements, but they did not. What do you think? Why do you think this time maybe they will implement some of those tasks?
I pray and hope that they will. One cannot predict what will happen, because it is quite possible that after 2 years somebody may say we extend again, which would be unfortunate. But I believe that the politicians have a duty to read the mood of South Sudan. The politicians have a duty to remember that a country cannot be in transition forever. And if they do that, then I hope that they will make this the last transition. Because if it is not, then it will create an appetite in some individuals to do things that are unconstitutional, which would be very sad and absurd at once.
Thank you, Professor. You once mentioned that South Sudan leaders South Sudan is a hunting ground where people make money and enjoy them in the neighboring countries. Has your perception changed about this?
In many ways, that has not changed. I would love to see a South Sudan with a stable Juba. I would want to see a South Sudan where all the 10 states are stable, a South Sudan that attracts. I would want to see a South Sudan which has working institutions in all critical areas, and that includes education, that includes health, in agriculture, in mining, in industrialization. And if that were to happen, there is no shortage of South Sudanese outside of the country. And I talked to many of them who would love to go back home. I talked to South Sudanese in Kenya, I talked to South Sudanese in Europe, in the United States of America, in Australia, who are doing very well outside of South Sudan. And they are looking forward to the day when the environment, politically and economically, will give them the opportunity to invest back at home. It is therefore incumbent upon the political class to create that environment so that people don't see South Sudan as a place where they go and get money, and once they have made money, they invest in Kenya, Uganda, Dubai, and other places, and therefore undermine the long-term stability of South Sudan.
Professor, you often speak of the varieties of natures of African leaders and their lack of democracy credentials. How do you rate South Sudan leaders, especially Kir and Machar?
You know, these were freedom fighters. And when you are dealing with freedom fighters, sometimes it is not very easy to transition from freedom fighter to a politician who understands the dynamics or appreciates the dynamics of modern day politics. In many African countries, and this is not only true of South Sudan, I see it in Zimbabwe, I see it to a limited extent in Namibia, I see it in South Africa. Freedom fighters think that the country owes them. And for that reason, they don't want to be questioned. They say, where were you when we were suffering in the bush? And it's very few of them who succeed in saying, we did our bit and we can therefore hand over the baton to another generation. One prays and hopes that President Kiir and Vice President Riek Machar and their other comrades in arms will see the wisdom of creating a new generation of South Sudanese who will not have the entitlement that the liberation fighters normally have, because good and sound leadership not only demands but requires that we have a long-term view of the country. That is why the Chinese are now conquering the world economically, because the Chinese plan for 100 years. They don't plan for the next election. The South Koreans are the same. The Vietnamese after the war are the same. The Japanese after the World War II are the same. Unfortunately, in many African countries, we think on a short-term basis, and we are obsessed with elections and its outcome without more.
Professor PLO, we have seen the civic space in South Sudan. Many times people are not having that freedom of expression. And what can South Sudan really leaders do to come out from this pathetic state?
You know, the whole idea of civic engagement is an exercise that must be undertaken by the state itself. Any state that wants to have long-term political health must create an environment where the population is engaged in civic participation. Mm-hmm. And that requires that they must responsibly be allowed to air their views, to contribute to governance. If that is not done, then what happens? You have a population that is timid. And when a population is timid, then they cannot be guarantors of sustainable democracy. And I'm using the word democracy to mean governance where people participate in making decisions through their leadership. Mm-hmm. And if the leadership is not doing the right thing, they question that leadership. And if they question that leadership has a duty to do that which is in the general overall interest of the population. But remember that in many instances, in many governments, particularly in Africa, thrive on the basis of the ignorance of the population. Mm-hmm. So the ignorance of the population becomes a very useful tool that is paradoxically used against the population. So that is one of the things that must happen in South Sudan. The people must be made to know that South Sudan is your country. Mm-hmm. That those who are leaders in your country are trustees of the resources of your country, and that they have a duty to ensure that those resources are managed and utilized for the benefit of the general good. And what are those benefits? That you have good infrastructure, that you have good health services, that you have good education, that you have opportunities to invent and innovate. If that does not happen, then ultimately the country will suffer.
Professor PLO, many times people have been saying the leaders have been supporting Salva Kiir's extension and being in power because they're using South Sudan as a market ground and for their produce and jobs. What do you think about, what is your take on this?
I hope that is not true, that the leaders in the region and the countries in the region are using South Sudan as a hunting ground, as it were. South Sudan is a member of the East African community, and it is incumbent upon leaders in the East African community to ensure that all member states enjoy peace. A peaceful South Sudan is good for East Africa in the long run. And you and me know that outside of oil, South Sudan can be a breadbasket. You and me know that outside of oil, South Sudan has many minerals, and South Sudan has a good measure of human resource. So if there are leaders who have a very short-term view of things and think that instability in South Sudan is in their best interest, they are deluding themselves. And it is our duty to call them out, to remind them that history has been consistent in demonstrating that if your neighbor's house is on fire, yours is also likely to be on fire, and it is therefore in your best interest that your neighbor's home is safe and secure.
Professor PLO, we have seen initiatives initiated by the regions and even outside the region concerning the peace talks in South Sudan with the holdout groups that have been against the government of South Sudan. Do you think this initiative, like Tumaini initiative in Kenya, going to bear fruits at long last?
Any initiative which is from outside of Sudan can only go so far. Ultimately, I've always held the view, and I still hold that view, that sustainable peace can only be mediated by the combatants, if you may, within South Sudan. Outsiders will come, they will attempt to midwife peace, but outsiders do not know the complexities within South Sudan. It is the South Sudanese themselves that know what the problems are. And if they were to make a solemn decision and say, we have been in conflict for too long, we want to bequeath to the next generation a peaceful South Sudan, they would not even need processes such as Tumaini. The president himself would summon an all South Sudanese conference in Juba and tell them, brothers and sisters, the time is now. Let us sit down and in honesty and truth, let us ask ourselves fundamental questions. Why did we fight? Have we achieved what we fought for? Is it in our best interest to allow our ambitions to stand in the way of South Sudan's progress? And let us answer those questions in the knowledge that we who had the honor and privilege of fighting for the liberation of South Sudan made our contribution, but that this fight is intergeneration. Because, as you know, we have had peace processes. People have signed agreements. People have signed things in Addis Ababa, in Machakos, in different parts of the world. And when they go home, they fail. So the outsider is not the one who is going to resolve the domestic problems of South Sudan. Those problems can only be resolved by South Sudanese, and the politicians have a duty to ensure that they achieve that. The sooner they realize that, the quicker they will recognize that South Sudan can only be rescued by South Sudanese.
Thank you, Professor. Let us look at the region in another way. The neighboring like Sudan that is at war right now, and the pipeline that is running through from South Sudan to Port Sudan. Do you think the war in Sudan is going to affect South Sudan economically, and that might again affect also the resources to hold election come
Without
2026?
doubt, if there is war in Sudan, and you and me know that most of the oil from South Sudan is exported through Port Sudan, that will ultimately affect South Sudan. Indeed, there was a period not too long ago when the Hemeti group said that they were going to disrupt the export of oil through Sudan. And that in itself must send a clear warning to South Sudan that in matters such as oil exportation, you cannot rely on one channel. The sooner they begin to think about exportation through East African Community or through Djibouti, the safer they are. And it is also important that South Sudan begins to refine some of the oil so that you don't export the crude. you refine the oil and make sure that you have something for domestic consumption. But without doubt, because we trade with our neighbors, if our neighbors are in trouble, then what they generate are refugees. They don't generate anything that is good. So it is in the best interest of South Sudan that in fact Sudan is at peace and that all the neighbors are at peace. And if they are, then economic progress is then realized in that way. And that is why the region has been very keen in ensuring that the disputes within the region are resolved. Not that they have done a good job. I don't think Africa has done a good job. I think IGAD has not done a good job. I think the African Union has been in comatose. And what we see, even in the attempt to resolve that conflict in Sudan, we see the Egyptians and the Emiratis and the Americans who are meeting in Jeddah and other places, and Africans are just silent. And yet, it is a problem that affects immediate neighbors such as Chad, of course, South Sudan, Ethiopia, and even Egypt and Libya.
Professor PLO, we have seen a lot of changes in the ministerial positions, especially Minister of Finance in South Sudan. We have seen the inflation rate in terms of the dollars against the South Sudanese pounds. On your own readings, what do you think need to be done? Is changing of the ministers from 1 month, 2 months to, that is going to solve the inflation in the country?
History is consistent in revealing to us that what keeps nation going are institutions. Once you have institutionalized processes, then human beings only come to ensure that those institutional prescriptions are implemented. To believe that there is an individual or group of individuals who have the power of Moses in the Bible will come and part economic Red Seas and cause economic pillars of fire to stand between us and poverty is completely misguided. So the question that we must ask is, what are the critical things that we do in our financial sector? What kind of central bank are we running? What kind of treasury are we running? What kind of taxation regimes do we have? What kind of banking system do we have? Do we ensure that there are no leakages within our system? Once you have done that, even if you have a cabinet minister who is not very well schooled, they will preside over a system which they cannot disturb nor change easily. So changing individuals in a game of musical chairs is not the solution. You cannot use, in a manner of speaking, aspirin to cure cancer. It requires clear intervention, and the time is now to re-examine, if assuming that it had been examined, to re-examine how the economy of South Sudan has been running since the year 2011, and to borrow from others. We must borrow. There is a book that has been written by a South Korean called Ha-Joon Chang. It's called The Bad Samaritans. And he reminds his readership that countries such as South Korea and many countries thrive because they allowed systems which were giving the oxygen of survival to their economic systems. And we can see, look at Singapore, look at Indonesia now, look at the South Korea that I've talked about, look at Vietnam, look at Mauritius. What is it that they are doing that is enabling them to thrive, even in the midst of these difficulties? Not trust in individuals. That is not to say that sound leadership is not necessary. It is necessary. But individuals come and go. But institutions, once they have been properly drilled down, solve almost 90% of the problems.
Having said that, Professor, it does that tell that South Sudan system is not up to today?
I think there are a lot of work to be done. There is a lot of work to be done. Remember also that South Sudan is only 13 years old since she regained her independence. And she will continue to make a number of mistakes. And it is their duty when they make those mistakes to be quick to resolve them. And also because they are living in an environment where we have had people make mistakes, we need not repeat the mistakes that have been made by others. And that is, we learn from success stories so that our journey to success is a little shorter. And that is why I've named the countries that I've named, because If South Sudan were to learn from them, then what it took those countries 50 years to achieve, South Sudan can achieve in 10 years.
Look at this, the legal system, Professor, in South Sudan. Accountability, justice and accountability in the country. People have been sacked, they have been accused of corruption here and there, they're relieved, and nothing is done about this. What is your say?
The problem in South Sudan, as in many African countries, is impunity. Impunity that is brought about by a system which has sacred cows, individuals who cannot be touched because they have credentials of freedom fighting. But countries succeed when impunity is given a death blow, when it is made known to every individual, however highly ranked, that if you do not obey the law, you'll be punished in accordance with the law. Once you do that, you send a very clear message to everybody that impunity will not be allowed in the country, and therefore those who engage in theft, those who engage in embezzlement of public funds will not do so, because they know that if they do, they will not only lose their liberty, but they'll also lose the ill-gotten wealth. Unfortunately, South Sudan, like many African countries, entertains too many sacred cows.
Professor, what robust solution would you prescribe to get the country out of this?
Number one, the most important thing is that the country must have political stability. In other words, there must be a political environment that enables all other sectors to thrive. And this requires that we have sustainable peace. And when we talk about sustainable peace, it is the kind of peace that will enable both those within South Sudan and outside South Sudan to know that this is a space where if I am an investor, I can come in and invest in the long term in the knowledge that nothing will interfere. Once you create an enabling political environment, then everything begins to kick in economically. Tourists begin to come in. Those who are in the sector of tourism will now know that they can sell things in a proper manner. Those who are in different sectors of the economy, investment, will know that they will be protected. Those who want to move goods within South Sudan will know that our goods can move. In other words, you become a magnet for things that will sustain the economy. And those outside of the economy, you also convince those who are young that they can go to school. And when they go to school, they'll have the opportunity to get opportunities for employment and to invent and innovate. But history has been consistent in demonstrating that the very primary thing that you must do is to create a political environment that allows all this to happen. Writing in 1983 in the little book, The Trouble with Nigeria, Chinua Achebe said that the most important thing is leadership of the political kind, because it is the stabilizer. And writing many years ago, Indian sage Vyas said that when politics stumbles, a country pays. So you must never allow politics to stumble. And politics in my context means the management of the affairs of a nation in their totality for the general good. In Africa, when we talk politics, we mean elections and the holding of power positions of privilege. That is not politics. So I believe that that is what must happen in Sudan. And it must also be realized by political leadership that leadership is a relay race. You run your leg and you hand over the baton to the next generation. As Mwalimu Nyerere ably said, you are not successful until your successor succeeds.
Professor Appiello, I'll give you this chance to send your message to the South Sudan leaders and its citizens for this time that we are talking about extensions, economy, we are talking about insecurity, we are talking about all kind of issue in South Sudan. What is your message to the leaders in South Sudan?
My message to the leaders in South Sudan is that God has given you the honor and privilege of presiding over the affairs of your nation. Think about your legacy. Ask yourself what it is that future generations will remember you for. Will they remember that you are the leaders who created an enabling environment and laid a foundation stone that will enable the South Sudanese of this generation and generations yet to be born to thrive in an environment of peace and prosperity? Or they'll remember you as individuals who, having been given the honor and privilege to serve, you used it for short-term personal benefit. The time is now. The extensions that you have given yourself this time round, I support them, but only on the understanding that there will be no further or other extension, and that period will be used to ensure that there is a proper constitutional dispensation, that census will be undertaken, that voters will be registered, and in the next electoral cycle, that the people will be enabled so that they do not vote on the basis of tribe or religion or on the basis of corruption. To the people of South Sudan, remember that good governance requires that the people are vigilant. And because South Sudan is a multi-ethnic community, let us remember that ethnicity in and of itself does not resolve problems. Let us use our diversity, whether you are Nuer or Dinka or Chollo. The duty is to ensure that you work to ensure that South Sudan is a thriving nation, and it can't be done if you engage yourself to ensure that South Sudan thrives for this generation and future generations.
Professor Piolo, thank you so much for your time, for fighting for the Pan-Africanism, and we really pray that God keep you, and we speak to you more times to come.
Thank you very much.
Thank you so much.
God bless you.